I don't need that. I have my own. I'm wired. Hello there. How are you? That is excellent news. This will be important for later, but I'm not going to talk about it now. I am going to talk about the thing you've come to hear about, which is a history of indoor lighting. And that's very important. I should find my own light, shouldn't I? Hello, videotape. So, obviously, we begin at the beginning with fire. Now, I'm not sure exactly when fire starts, a long time ago. But it is our primary mode of lighting really until around 1880, when there's a cool new invention. And you get not a lot of efficiency for your energy. You know, you get about 0.16 lumens per watt, and you produce what we in the business like to call 1 candle power. Your candle lasts, I don't know, 6 hours-ish. You could have, if you'd like, a lamp with oil in it. You could do anything, but even fire is your first thing. But then, in 1880, the light bulb. I know, it's so exciting. Now, think about this. We've gone from 0.16 lumens per watt to 16 lumens per watt, 100 times greater efficiency. And look, 1,200 lumens of light, 100 times, effectively almost, 100 times more light and 100 times more efficiency. This is very exciting. And a bulb that lasts 1,000 hours. I mean, what are you going to do with 1,000 hours of light? That's very exciting. But, a few years ago, a new technology, compact fluorescence. 4 times more efficient now, 60 lumens per watt, and a lifespan of 15,000 hours. But even that's going away. It's not particularly healthy for the environment. There's heavy metals involved. Soon, though, friends, I'm not sure exactly when. I'm postulating, I don't know, in a year or two. But soon, the prevalence of LED lighting. Look at this, 160 lumens per watt. That's 1,000 times more efficient than candles. And 100,000 hours of lifespan in that bulb, which, ironically, we're still designing to fit into a socket that was designed 100 years ago, but still. And so the question that I would like to ask today is, which one of those is best? This is, for you guys, a question. Yes? Candle, why?
It's much more romantic.
Oh, see, I knew we would begin with the mood, right? Because there's sometimes when you don't necessarily want to be efficient, you want to be, romantic. You're willing to burn off a little energy to create an environment that's, warm and inviting and friendly. But there are other criteria you might use, yeah. It depends, actually. A candle is not getting a lot of efficiency. So it could be better for the environment. It depends how sustainable the stuff you make your candle out of is. And it depends how many candles you need to light something, right? Because it's not producing a lot of light, it turns out. An LED actually is, again, 1,000 times more efficient. And it produces 100 times more light at 1,000 times more efficiency. That's pretty good. But some people, for example, don't like the quality of compact fluorescence. Oh, it's too blue. I don't like the way it makes me look. If you're judging by something like durability, how much battering a light bulb can stand, you might choose another kind. For example, LEDs can be bashed all around, and they survive really well. They don't have very many breakable parts in them. Or if you're looking at pervasiveness, if you're looking at how easy it is to get things, well, it's pretty hard right now, for example, to get LED bulbs. You might choose something else. It turns out you can't say uniformly this one is better over that one. You have to think about why. You have to think about the situation, the context. But ultimately, one of the things we're all thinking about has to do with sustainability, right? How long can we keep affording burning off so much energy as heat without producing light? And I want to ask that same question today about school. Can we keep just burning off all this energy that our students are producing without capturing that and using that to produce light? And I ask that because our students have, perspectives that I think suggest that there's a problem in the system, right? We hear from our students all the time, this isn't about me, it's not real, it's not important, it's not relevant. And that suggests that there's a fundamental problem in the system. And something else does too. A recent study. How many of you have seen this? This is Poe, Swenson, and Picard. They published it this year. So what they did is they found a way to put a brain scan unit on people that people can wear 24 hours a day. And this is a student's brain scan for a week. Do you notice any patterns? Nothing is happening in class. Does class look like anything else on here? TV. TV and class are identical. There's really no brainwaves. Sleep. There's tons of stuff going on in sleep. In fact, if you want your students to get a really good brain workout, let them sleep in your class. Because class isn't doing anything for them. So why is that? In what ways are class and TV similar? So it's interesting. We, at my school, we've tried to kind of think through some of this stuff and figure out how it all works. And we've turned to a few people who have helped us think this through. One of the people we spend a lot of time with is our friend Marshall McLuhan. Do you guys know McLuhan? He shows up briefly in Annie Hall. It's a very funny little scene. McLuhan flourishes in the 60s and 70s. He had the unfortunate accident of living 50 years before he was supposed to. But he is the patron saint of Wired magazine. I don't know if all magazines have patron saints, but anyway, McLuhan is their patron saint. Famous for, came up with the term the global village, thought a lot about media and how it works. His book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, is a classic and really worth reading. And I think it illuminates a lot of what's going on in culture today. And of course, The Medium is the Message was a famous text he wrote. And he said two things that I think are really interesting. The first thing he said is that technologies are extensions of the self. And what that means is that technology and identity are inherently linked to one another. That this is part of who you are. Which is why it's interesting. When you tell students to put these things away, part of what you're telling them is you're making a judgment about their identity as well. You're telling them to put part of themselves away. Because their technology is not distinguishable from who they are. And, interestingly, it's not distinguishable from who you are either. Which is why there's resistance when people... What do you mean you're getting rid of all the overhead projectors? I'm the king of the overhead projector. Are you suggesting I'm not valuable anymore? Right? We have these connections. The second thing he said is, we're always living way ahead of our thinking. So if you want to see what's next, don't look at theory, look at popular culture. And McLuhan was one of the first people to really think about the role of popular culture. So let's think about popular culture for just a minute, and maybe that'll give us some kind of hint about where we ought to go if we're going to design something to stop the whole problem of students feeling irrelevant and having no brainwaves in our classes. So, how many of you guys know him? Hands high, be proud. What are the rest of you doing with your free time? I mean, I know Arkansas used to be the land of opportunity. Now it's just sportsman's Is there something about that? What is it now? The natural state. So you don't even have to. It's just natural. But come on, what are you doing with your free time? So who is this guy? The three of you who raised your hands. Fun2. His name is Fun2. Well, that's his handle. Yeah. And what does he do? He does. So his first famous meme, his first famous YouTube video was him playing Pachelbel's canon on his electric guitar. And I mean, it is an amazing version. He didn't make up the version, but he plays it so well. It is a version of Pachelbel's canon that shreds. And he's doing it right in his bedroom. See, look, there's his bed right there. And there's his desk with his computer on it. You can see some stuff. And he's recording himself on a webcam. And you never see his face, by the way. He wears a baseball hat. And he never looks up. But he plays this amazing version of Pachelbel's canon, which he does because he can, and which he posts up onto YouTube because he can. And, not surprisingly, more than 10 million people, a few of whom are in this room, have watched him play. Now, a really interesting thing happens. He puts that video up on YouTube, and first of all, a bunch of people say, wow, that's amazing. What an amazing version of Pachelbel's canon. Then, a bunch of people start posting their videos of them playing his version of Pachelbel's canon. And then something really interesting happens. But it's probably something that happens in your classes as well. So, it turns out this is really hard. You have to be really good at the electric guitar to play this version of Pachelbel's canon, and not everybody can do it. So, as you would imagine, a bunch of people write to Fun2, and they say, look, there's a great version of Pachelbel's canon, but it's really hard. Could you please post something harder? Because nobody really wants to do stuff that's easier. People want a challenge. So his next video is him playing Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Now this requires him to play the guitar twice because there's counterpoint, and so he's playing it twice and he's playing it at the same time. He has to film himself twice, wears different baseball hats actually in the two versions, and that's gotten more than 10 million hits as well. Again, not by most of you. But it's something he can do, it's something he can do for free, and it gets him so much attention that when Van Halen is touring South Korea, where he lives, where he's a high school student, they invite him up on stage to play with Eddie. And the reason for this is our students can now carry around in their pockets effectively equipment and studios that would have cost hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars just a few years ago. They carry around in their pockets a recording studio with access to more ears than ever before in human history. They carry around in their pockets for free a movie studio with access to more screens than even the largest motion picture industries. They carry around in their pockets a printing press with access to the planet. And they do it for free, effectively. And they do it every single day. Let me give you one example of the repercussions of this. So, and I apologize, this information is a year old, which means it's completely irrelevant. One of the most renowned collections of photographs in the world, one of the most significant collections, is in the U.S. Library of Congress. Right? This is the largest collection of photographs. It is the most important collection for historians, many people would suggest. If this square represents all of the photos in that renowned global collection, then this is the relationship of that to all of the photos on Instagram. And if this is all of the photos on Instagram, this is the relationship of that to all the photos on Flickr. And if this is all the photos on Flickr, this is the relationship of that to all the photos on Facebook. As of a year ago, Facebook had 140 billion photos on it. That's 20 photos for every person on the planet, which makes it 1,000,000% bigger than the collection in the Library of Congress. Yes, you say, but it's all just, pictures of people at parties and their cats. So why is this place important? Anyone? Have you heard of this place? It's not in Arkansas. There was a big volcano, and what happened? It preserved a lot of stuff. It turns out we knew a lot about very powerful Romans from the first century. We knew a bunch of stuff about them. But what we didn't know was what the lives of everyday people were like. When Vesuvius poured out its lava and its pyroclastic flow, when it wiped out Pompeii in just a couple of hours, it preserved everything. We know what their bread looked like. And it preserved the stories of common people. What we had effectively before was the Library of Congress. We knew the big stories, but we didn't know the stories of everyday life. I promise you that 500 years from now, the photographic collection on Facebook will be one of the most important archives for historians ever in the history of the world, because it will show what people thought about everyday events, how they celebrated the little victories and tragedies of their lives. It will help us understand ourselves better. Any Fold-It players in here? Do you guys know Fold-It? Are you a Fold-It player? Dude? Does anyone know what this is? I'm sorry? It is. It's a protein folding game, as you would imagine. I mean, what else are you doing with your free time, right? You're clearly not watching Fun2 on YouTube, so you might as well be folding proteins. Now, the great thing about it is it's a puzzle game. That's really all it is. You don't have to have degrees in biomedicine. You don't have to understand biochemistry. All you do is you learn a few simple rules about how proteins fold, right? And it's a game. As you can see, you can play it with a group or you can play it as a single player. And your task is to make the protein that folds the most efficiently. And to understand that. Now, the reason this game got made is scientists recognized that it turns out some of the most important issues of our day have to do with proteins and how they fold. Mad cow disease, for example, is caused by proteins misfolding. Many cancers are implicated in how proteins fold. And so they built this game so that people could play it, because people love to solve problems. They love to do hard things, it turns out. Except in school, that's interesting. And it just lets people play this game. Now, about a decade ago, researchers recognized, it turns out that proteins also help things like viruses implant. And they recognized that there was a protein on the AIDS virus that allowed it to implant itself and transfer its genetic code to healthy cells. If you could figure out how to block that protein, you could stop the AIDS virus from implanting. But you have to understand how the protein works first. So, scientists got supercomputers crunching on that protein to figure out how that protein folds. And those supercomputers crunched on that protein for 10 years without significant results. So the scientists thought, well, what the heck? We'll put it in, fold it, and just see what happens. Gamers in Fold-It solved the protein in 2 weeks. Here's the article from Nature where they published their results. Now, if you know anything about scientific publication, the order of authors is very important, and the order tells you the contribution. So here's the first author, Firas Khatib, the second author, Frank DeMaio, the third author, the Fold-It Contenders Group, the fourth author, the Fold-It Void Crushers Group. And they did it because they could. Now, not everybody got the right answer, right? This is all the results of that protein. And you can see every little black square represents one person's shot at folding the protein, or one group's shot at folding the protein. But it turned out not everybody has to do well, just a few people do. What you need is to get a lot of people messing with it. And a few people made transformational discoveries that helped solve this protein. Because it turns out our students are living lives all the time where they're building things and contributing things and putting stuff up online. This is what they do with their free time. And if you take a few examples of this, if you think about how it works, let's take Wikipedia as an example. By the way, I love Wikipedia, right? In study after study, more accurate than Britannica, which went out of print this year, in part because of Wikipedia, right? And if you think about how this works, there's an interesting structure. So the first thing that happens is everybody can access Wikipedia. So everybody does. I certainly do. Now, obviously, this is not, I don't want to see this in a PhD dissertation where someone is, citing a fact from Wikipedia. An encyclopedia is useful as a starting point for getting information. But it's a really useful starting point. And because it's electronic, it can add stuff right away. Right? So people go there. They go there because they can, and they look at stuff. And as they look at stuff, it turns out they start being custodians of stuff. How many people, has anyone in here added to or edited a Wikipedia entry? Yeah, a lot of you have, because you can. You know something, you have information, you put it up there, the community vets that information. But it's a way for you to contribute. Oh, I know something about that. I'll throw that stuff up there. So you start being a custodian. You say, well, I've got some stuff that I can bring to this community and benefit this community. That custodianship produces more and more diversity. The thing about Britannica is because they had just a few people working, it couldn't grow very fast. It was nice for, things like the War of 1812 and, amino acids, as long as you didn't want anything brand new about amino acids. But their section, for example, on Klingon poetry was woefully small. Their collection of Japanese anime in Britannica was very small. But Wikipedia has all kinds of stuff. And Wikipedia, for example, can have stuff like information about Foldit, which it turns out would take years to find its way into something like Britannica. In Wikipedia, it can be there that day. It gets more and more diverse. And of course, the increasing diversity makes it a richer and richer resource, which brings more and more access. And that access, in turn, leads to participation, and participation to custodianship, and custodianship to diversity, and diversity to access. It's a cycle that builds and gets bigger and bigger. And if this is what our students are doing with their lives, if this is the kind of way popular culture is moving, then I'd like to suggest that there's this increasing chasm between how students live their lives outside of the university and how they live their lives inside of the university. A kind of geologic fault line that divides their experience. Because most of us aren't doing that kind of stuff. And if we're thinking about redesigning spaces, if we're thinking about redesigning educational experiences, then it's maybe time to think about what that design should look like. So, another really important figure. Charles and Ray Eames, a husband and wife team, they do some really interesting stuff. They work together. They do one of the first informational videos. Has anyone seen Powers of 10? A few people have. It's really interesting, right? It starts with a couple on a picnic blanket, they're having a picnic, and then it zooms out 10 times, and then 10 times, and 10 times, and 10 times, and 10 times until you get to the edge of the universe. And then it zooms back into them, and then it zooms in 10 times, and 10 times, and 10 times until you're at the subatomic level. IBM wanted them to help personalize computing, and so they paid them in the 60s to kind of think about information. So Charles said this about design. Design is a plan for arranging elements in such a way as to accomplish a particular purpose. A particular purpose. So if we think about design, we're not just talking about something you do because you're supposed to do it. We're talking about design as something that changes things, that establishes a purpose. So let's think about design. Now, we can't think abstractly, so we might as well think about something concrete like this room. This is a lovely room, by the way. Nicely done. Go Red Wolves. So I figure there are kind of 5 things you can look at when you look at an educational space. You can look at its structure, you can look at its orientation, its flexibility, its equipment, and its infrastructure, right? How it's built, where it faces, how changeable it is, how it's furnished, that is the equipment that's in it, and then the infrastructure that supports that equipment. So let's think about this space and what this space tells us about the purpose that's being enacted here. So what can you tell me about this space? What do you notice about it? It is a large space, so you could have a lot of people in here. What else do you notice about it? Accessible. What do you mean by accessible? Anyone can come in and use it. I guess it's on the second floor, isn't it? Third floor. So, but they're elevators, so it could be accessible even if you couldn't, say, walk up here. You've got a bunch of doors. That's handy. I like the windows. Why are there no windows? Huh. Why is it an interior room, though? That's the question, right? You don't want distractions, right? This is a room that's about focus. And there's a direction that this room points, isn't there? At least right now, at least today, it looks like. On the count of 3, let's point to the front of the room. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3, point. That was weird. Not everybody pointed in the same. A lot of you pointed up here, though. Why are you pointing up here? I'm here. Anything else up here? The screens are here. Yeah, look at that. That's exciting. The screens are up there. So, that's still the front of the room, I'm assuming. Hi, how are you?
Good.
I'm glad to hear that. Hi, you can't follow me now. Ha ha ha. What are you doing? Why are you following me? I'm the front, but I thought that was the front because it had the screens. Many of you look like you're having kind of neck problems now. That's fascinating. What have I just done? What's the problem I've just created? There is a part of the focus that's about my placement, and there's a part of the focus that's about the informational placement. And I've now divided those two, because you don't know what's going on. If you look at me, you don't know what's going up on the screen. If you look at the screen, you don't know what I'm doing, and I could be doing all kinds of weird things back here. I've divided the front of the room, right? But it seems like for most of you, the real front of the room is me, because most of you are looking at me. Thank you for worshiping me. That is excellent. How flexible is this room? Huh? Semi-flexible. Why would you say that? You can cut it into thirds. Anything else flexible about this room? There's no fixed seating, so you can move stuff around. Right. So, your table and your table, I'd like you to form rows without disturbing anyone else. Go. Rows. Don't move the table. It's amazing, by the way, that people will do things that you tell them to do like this, isn't it? Don't do that anymore. That's just silly. I don't know what you're doing. Stop that. Stop that. It turns out there is a problem. Well done, though. That's a beautiful row. Well rowed. It turns out this room is really flexible until people get in it, at which point it's almost not flexible at all. Because it's actually really hard for you to maneuver because you got the tables in the way and there's no way to get rid of the table. Now you can't, right? So it's flexible until there are people, at which point it locks down. This is true of many of the spaces we create educationally, by the way. What kind of equipment is in here? Not the kind that needs to be. Wow, that was a very cynical answer.
Seriously, half of it's not adequate for what you need to have in the room.
It is a problem because if this is the front and this is the informational front, the people who accidentally sat on the wrong side of the table have had to kind of scooch around, and some of you are having neck problems. And how many of you have a stage? I have a stage. I have a microphone stand. You do not have a microphone stand. How many of you have access to power for your laptop like I do? That's an infrastructure piece. I do. Look right there. I have access to the big screens, too. Do you guys have big screens? No. Ha ha ha! I am the king of this room. That's exciting. This room is telling you something about the purpose of this room. And it's telling you something about your function in that purpose and my function in that purpose, right? What is your job? To pay attention and listen. Now, it's kind of nice. You've answered several of my questions, but it's been hard to get you to answer my questions, and many of you have not answered my questions. You've just sat there. If I was sitting at the table with you, and we were eating our lovely chicken, and you didn't ask, that would be rude, wouldn't it? But in this space, it's not rude. Why? I get to talk all the time, but the pressure on you is not to talk most of the time because, well, part of the message of this room, right, is that there's a pile of you and you're all the same. So really, if one of you talks, then that's good enough. Right? This room is suggesting something about your participation and my participation. This room, the function, the design of this room dictates part of what happens. And it suggests, for example, that many of my questions functionally need to be rhetorical. I don't really care what your answers are. I have a stage. I have the power. A person who's really helped me think about this is Sugata Mitra. How many of you know Sugata Mitra? Oh my gosh. We'll find out about him. Now, go. You have 1 minute. Oh, I can't believe this. Who is Sugata Mitra? He did the hole-in-the-wall experiment. What's the hole-in-the-wall experiment? Or did you not read that far? So, he lives in Delhi, originally. He's recently, he was at Newcastle University, and now he's at MIT. He's just moved to MIT. But he's in Delhi, and he has this problem. He recognizes this problem, that there are some places in the world, he says, where teachers can't go or where teachers won't go. And in those places, the children are lost. What does he do for a job? He's a professor of education. He's a professor of education. And so this is a real crisis for him. How do you do teaching in places where teachers won't or can't go? So the thing he does is he builds networked computers with pointing devices into the walls of initially Delhi, then other slums around India, then slums in Asia and Africa. He's trying to understand, could technology alone teach children? And could access alone teach children? And he puts hidden cameras up originally in Delhi, and he watches what happens. So he builds these things in at kid height and just leaves them there. And here's what happens. A kid will come along and see the computer and mess with it, and then go away. And then come back with more kids, and those kids will start showing each other stuff and, trying to outdo each other at stuff, and they will start learning. In fact, Mitra's idea is that learning is a self-organizing system. Like these other things, right? There are all kinds of online experiences that are self-organizing, where people, Wikipedia is self-organizing, Flickr is self-organizing, right? Where people who do really interesting, good work kind of rise to the top and the community builds around them. And what Mitra says is, he recognizes that you only really need two things for education to happen. The only things you need, he says, are access and community. So if you're thinking about how to design stuff at your school, part of what you need to think about, according to Mitra, is everything that you build, the structure, the orientation, the flexibility, the equipment, the infrastructure, all that should support access and community. Wait a minute. Something weird just happened. Did anyone in this room know about Sugata Mitra? Yes, I did. I knew about Sugata Mitra. I put him in my slideshow. I spent 10 minutes talking to you about how I was the center of the room. And the minute I asked you a question that you clearly knew I knew, nobody asked me. What did you do? You reached into a pocket or onto your table where you had something, and you typed in Sugata Mitra. And some of you went to TED, and some of you went to Wikipedia, and some of you went to Google, and some of you went to, probably no one went to Bing, but you know what happens. It's Do you realize what that means?
It's not very popular.
Not that. Do you recognize the fundamental shift that you just illustrated? I know there's all this talk about digital natives and digital immigrants, and frankly, it's a tired division now, because at the very least, you are all naturalized citizens. 20 years ago, if I had asked you that same question, what would have happened? You would have had two options. One would have been you would have had to go to the library after this session, which a lot of you would not have done, which I didn't do as a student. Or you would have waited for me to tell you about Sugata Mitra. It turns out, though, that according to Mitra, the only thing you need is access and community. And a really interesting thing happened. Did you listen to what was happening when you were looking up about Sugata Mitra?
Yes.
You guys, there was a moment of silence while everybody got your device and typed in. And then you started getting results. And almost instantly, you turned to someone near you and said, oh, he's at Newcastle University. No, he's not anymore. He's at MIT. Oh, well, he did the hole in the wall. Did you know what I don't know what that is. Do you want? We started talking to each other. Because the only two things you need, according to Mitra, are access and community. The interesting thing is the one thing you don't need, which you just proved, is me. Because learning is a self-organizing system, which means teachers emerge out of the system itself. Now, you did need me in one sense, right? You needed me, for example, to create the hole that you could fill with Sugata Mitra information. But you didn't need me to fill that hole. I understand the irony of me telling you that lectures are silly in a lecture. Though I do think lectures have a really useful purpose, but it's not an informational purpose. You don't need me for information anymore. You just proved that. What you do need me for is inspiration. What you do need me for is to tweak you into doing something. But you need to be the ones who do it. And what that suggests is a really different connection between information and authority and design that's very different than maybe what we've been thinking before. Yeah, you're unhappy about this. I can tell because you've been going like this for the last several minutes.
There are lectures good for disseminating new information. TED Talks, I think, kind of disproves
You know, at some point, I need access and community. So if a lecture, for example, introduces people, if it provides access, and if it gives me a community of people to work from, then absolutely. But if it's not about doing that, then no. How many of you thought, when I asked that question, how many of you consciously went through a list of things like, he just asked me to find out about Sugata Mitra. Let's see, what are my options? I could go to the library, but no, that's not a good option. How many of you went through a list, a conscious list like that? How many of you just reached for your device without thinking about it? If this is what you do now, how many of you have had one of these for more than half of your life? A device that you carried around in your pocket that let you access information wherever you were? If this is what you do, what do you expect your students to do, who have in fact grown up with these kinds of things? And what does it mean for you to tell them, look, this room says I'm the one in authority, put that stuff away? It turns out our spaces are communicating things. They are communicating a particular purpose. And what we typically build is isolated spaces designed for rhetorical questions. Questions, by the way, for which we already have the answers. They're in the back of the book. And those questions presume a static world. That the answers will always be the answers, will always be the answers, will always be the answers. But I'm not sure how much bubbling in those answers is really preparing our students to face the dynamic world that we live in. Seth Godin at last year's EDUCAUSE said, never again is someone going to pay you to look up information, give them answers rather they can look up online. They'll only pay you to solve problems that don't yet have answers. I think that's absolutely right. So if the practice you're giving your students, informed by the spaces you're designing, is, well, just give me the answer that's in the back of the book, I'm not sure you're really preparing them for the world. And I'm not sure then that our classrooms are communicating something that we truly value. Because what they're almost always communicating is not access and community. What they're almost always communicating is isolation, control and isolation. Let me give you an example of this by means of a humorous formula. So, if you're in a context that you don't understand, and you use research and collaboration to understand that context, and if you amplify those with technology, in almost every case, we would call that's ingenuity. That's using your resources well. You didn't know about a situation, you talked to people about it, you did some research about it, you used your technology to find out about it. Well done. In class, we call that... Isn't that weird? Because, by the way, that's the only place now where we would do that. How dare you look stuff up? How dare you talk to other people? I mean, how many of you, in your professional activities as scholars, how many of you work like this? Work without, I don't talk to anyone else, no one is allowed to see my stuff, I can only do my own work. I mean, isn't collaboration an essential part of what you do every single day? You know, you write an article, you let some friends read it, what do you think about that? You're constantly in these communities, and you're using technology to do that, and yet there's this weird thing that, you know, it seems like the three things we really seem to want most in our classrooms, we want from our students, we want their attendance and their compliance and their uniformity. And it's purely accidental that these spell the initials of my school, right? And that grows out of a particular model that grew out of a particular moment in cultural history. The idea was, right, not only should we standardize parts, but we should standardize people. So that, you know, if there's a whoever, I mean, I'm a medievalist, if there's a medievalist and that medievalist goes away, then I can plug another medievalist right in, right? And that focus on uniformity, that focus that, for goodness sakes, our ridiculous educational institutions in the U.S. are right focused on, where we're standardizing as though you could ever standardize. If we really got that, would that be a machine that worked? If if the machine was made up of identical parts? I mean, we talk about educational transformation. We recognize that we need change. But transformation is not taking the tools of the past and kind of cramming them into the structures of the present, right? I mean, there is an app for that, but that's not what we're really after. But that's what we've done with technology so much. And the problem is, it's because we focus on the technology. We say, well, the technology, that's the big thing. No, it's not. For most of human existence, the technology has not been the focus. The technology is just a means. And we've dreamed these amazing dreams about what that could let us do. Not the technology itself, but what the technology enabled us to be. So, 100 years ago, we were imagining, could you imagine a world where you could hold a device in your hand that would let you video chat with people far away? Wouldn't that be an amazing world that would connect people in that way? Because that's what they were thinking about in 1925. Or could you imagine a world where you could have like a digital book and you could read, whatever books you wanted to, provided you had some giant machine, I guess. But that's what they were dreaming of in the 30s. Like this access that you would have. Could you imagine having in your home an infinite library of resources that you could, inexplicably project on the ceiling for some reason, but, still... Because let me just say, that world of 1959 may be closer than you think. Could you imagine, with the writers of popular science in 1961, could you imagine having an answer machine in your house? And you could ask it questions like, who invented the phonograph? And it would say, Thomas Edison did. And you would say, wow, when did that happen? And it would say 1877. And you could say, show me a picture of that. And it would. And you could print that picture out if you wanted. And then you could say, play the sound from it. And it would. And then you could say, wow, that's really cool. Show me a movie about that. And it would show you a movie. And then you could say, I'm tired of Edison. Show me about Leonardo. And then it would. Because that used to be the world of science fiction. We call it something a little different today. So, are the rooms we're designing, do they suggest a kind of science fiction view? Is this really, what we wanted, what we dreamed of that education could do for us? The average assignment at my school goes something like this. It starts out at my desk. I tell my students something they should do. It goes to their desk. They work on it for a while. They send it back to my desk. I look at it, and then I send it back to their desk. And that's just kind of the standard structure. It's a structure that has an impact on the world. But it's not necessarily a positive impact. I'm burning off enormous amounts of energy not doing anything useful. And the way I know that, by the way, is that last step where it goes back to the students. That's an unnecessary step. And I know that's true because students turn in their big final projects at the end of the semester, and I don't have time to, comment on them and get them back to them because it's coming in, the last day of class. So I say, hey, I'll look at these and I'll have them for you, and you can come back by next semester and we'll talk about them. It'll be great. And they just sit there. Every semester at my school, I figure that these projects represent about 5,000 hours of student time. The average student spends about 50 hours working on these projects. In our classes, in our school, there's about 25 students per class. Teachers teach 4 classes. That's about 5,000 hours per teacher per term. That's just being burned off as nothing. And there's this notion, right, that, well, I teach my students serve the community. But what I'd like to propose is something a little different, something that connects all of us in a much more robust way. So I don't want to just give my students information that they can consume. I mean, that's, been our main focus. I give you information, and you're supposed to consume it, and then show me that you've consumed it by repeating it back to me. I want to add a couple of other activities to that. I want people to take that information and indeed consume it, but I want them then to curate that information, to organize it together like in a museum, right? To organize it together to tell a story. And I want them to add their own creation to that information. And I want them to collaborate robustly in that process, because this is a much more, just one C, that's not so powerful. But when you get C4, that's something that could really do something, right? And the benefit of it is in its perspectives, in its multiplicity of perspectives. That's what makes it a beautiful system. Not that I want uniformity, in fact, but what I want is diversity. Because it turns out, if you stand in one place and you look at something, you see one truth. If you stand somewhere else, you see something fundamentally different. And it's not that those truths are, well, that's just perspective. They're actually fundamentally different things. Which means the more perspectives I have, the more diversity I have, the more diverse my access is, the more I understand about the world. And the more I can make informed decisions about that. So, the job for teachers is not to try to cram students into a predetermined grid. Instead, I think our task is to build complex infrastructures into which students can place their efforts as spaces into which they can move, and they're going to move into all kinds of weird spaces and do all kinds of weird things. That's my job as a teacher. So I want to take some of the things that have sort of dominated education, and I want to replace them. I want to take the sort of linearity of classroom design, that you start here and then you just, kind of move forward and you never get to come back again. I want to replace that with recursivity. I want students constantly working, not just to move forward, but working with the students who are coming behind them. I want to take the isolation of the classroom and replace that with connection. I want to take this kind of weird hierarchical view and replace that with community. And I want to take simulation, which focuses so much. I mean, that's almost all I've done as an English teacher in my career, is simulate stuff, pretend stuff. I want to take that and I want to replace it with real-world engagement. Let me give you one quick example of this. The summer before she came to our school, one of our students a couple of years ago, she'd spent the summer working at a halfway house in Romania for students who had, for young women who had been sexually trafficked. These women came from Nepal primarily. And she's working there, she's doing that the summer, she's 17, she's doing that the summer before she comes to college. And at a certain point she has this epiphany. She recognizes those girls that she's helping are her age. The only difference between them is the accident of where they were born and the accident of the access they had to education and to financial help. And this plagues her. If she's born in the wrong place, she could be on the other side of that equation. But she's 17. What can she do? So she goes to school and she's thinking about this. She's a political science major. Her roommate's an international business major. And they're talking about it. How do you solve a problem like the global sexual trafficking of women? Well, you can't do something big. But you could do something small. So they weave together some red thread bracelets, like this one, right here. They weave these things together, and they sell them in our campus store, $3. And they take that money, and they send it to Nepal. They work some relationships out with some agencies there, where the money goes to buy legal assistance for women, to buy education for women, in some cases to buy women out of slavery. And the women who are rescued start weaving red thread bracelets as well and sending them back, and they sell them in the campus center. And they start, kind of organizing people around them as they're getting more and more stuff. Well, they need help we need some kind of web presence, but they're not web designers. But they've got friends who are, in computer science. They get them to design a website. They get English major friends, to tell the story about it. They get music major friends to start throwing concerts. They get other business major friends to build a database so they're tracking, their inventory. They get all these people around them, and pretty quickly they're not just selling stuff in our campus store, they're selling stuff at more than 50 colleges and universities throughout the U.S. They're starting to move internationally. And to date, they've saved thousands of women. And they've gotten significant acclaim for it, these two students, an international business major and a political science major. So here's the question. Are they learning more from their classes or this? Is it more important to be able to repeat information on a test or to be able to work in the world to make a real change? I guarantee you it's this. And in fact, my task now in the Honors College is we're working to redesign the entire honors curriculum around that model. Because what we want to start doing, there's no reason to keep burning off all of this energy of our students. Why are we doing that? As they move not only through their careers at the university, but as they move even through individual classes. Yeah, we maybe need to start out with something that wastes some energy but creates a welcoming and warm environment. But by the time they're mastering the material, they should be burning less as heat and making more light for the community around them. Which brings us to the Horta. Does anyone recognize the Horta? All right. Yes, The Devil in the Dark, right, which is listed up at the top. It's an episode of Star Trek that first premiered on the 9th of March, 1967. In this episode, the Enterprise finds itself circling Janus 6, which is a mining planet. It's on stardate 3196.1. Everyone knows that. And this mining planet is really important. They're mining, I think, a number of different things, but including dilithium crystals, which is why the Enterprise is there in the first place. But there's a problem, because there's this creature on the planet that is killing the miners. And the head miner has contacted the Enterprise and asked for their help. And so, of course, an away team beams down, and they find this creature, this murderous creature, and Kirk and Spock zap it with the phasers and slice a chunk off of it, which those unfortunate fellows in red shirts, by the way, will not learn a whole lot more about. But it's this weird, substance, and they can't figure it out. They know that this creature can move through rock the way we move through air. In fact, it leaves all these little tunnels around, and they're trying to figure out what in the world is motivating this creature. Kirk, by the way, this episode is William Shatner's favorite episode ever. Kirk finds this room full of, these weird spheroids, and he asks the mining guy about them, and he says, yeah, no, they're just getting in our way. We've been getting rid of them. They're a pain, and they're in the way of a lot of the minerals we're trying to find. So we got rid of them. We threw them all in this one place. Yeah, it turns out, when the Horta comes back, it recognizes that they can hurt it. So it squats on a rock and then moves away, and it says, "No kill I." And they take this as a sign that maybe they can have some sort of relationship. And so, of course, Spock mind melds with it and cries out, "Pain! The Vault of Ages!" And he understands the Horta, because it turns out that those are, in fact, the Horta eggs. Every 10,000 years, all of the Horta but one die out. And that one, its job is to care for the brood of new Horta that will emerge. And the problem is, the miners thought what they had to do was fight the Horta. But remember, the Horta can move through rock like it's air. And so they start collaborating together. Now that they understand one another, they start working together. And so the Horta takes them to new, the Horta doesn't care about the minerals that the miners are after, and the miners don't have to use their heavy equipment. And so all of a sudden there's this collaborative relationship that produces amazing stuff. I think for much of our history, we've treated our students like the Horta. But if we collaborate together, we can do amazing things. So to students who say, I'm just a number, we need to start customizing. Let them find the thing that works for them, that makes sense for their educational stuff. For the people who say, look, this is just busy work, let's recenter it around real activities in the real world. For people who say, it's irrelevant, we need to focus on engagement. And remember, engagement is a two-way relationship. Right? I hear teachers all the time say, well, my students just aren't engaged. But I don't see them being very engaged either. This is relational. And it requires both of us to work together. And for people who say, look, it's not about the real world, then we've got to find a way to integrate our learning in that real world environment. Our students are connected now in ways unheard of before, unbelievable, even a few short years ago. And that's important, because it turns out the most significant problems facing us right now are not problems that can be solved from one perspective or one discipline. They are all massively interconnected to one another. And what they require is multiple perspectives, people working in multiple locations, and people understanding and approaching things multiply inherently. In fact, we recognize many of the problems we now face are problems because we've tried to isolate things off and slice things up. You can't change one thing without changing all the other things around it. So the old mantra, right, the old mantra of real estate is that it's all about location, 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 which at Jonesboro is a lovely place. But I think the new model, and the new model for school is not location, location, location. The new model is connection, connection, connection. Because it turns out that your new classroom has already been designed. Now, this is going to feel weird at first. When you change a technology, it makes you feel a little nervous. The stuff that you've always done before kind of, well, I don't know what to do now. I mean, you know, for generations we've had fire, and now, where do I light the match? No, you don't have to light a match. Well, this is bad. It's going to make me not sleep. No, it's going to be okay. It'll feel weird for a little while. And then, it'll be as easy as flipping on a light switch. Thanks very much.
We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Dr. Pratt has his hand up first, and we'll start there. If you would use microphones, everybody can hear your question, or speak really loud. I think you can probably hear mine.
But I think it's for the video.
Oh, well, I hate talking.
No, of course.
So, excellent talk, by the way.
Hey, thanks.
But let me play devil's advocate.
Excellent.
You started off talking about McLuhan.
Yeah.
For me, McLuhan's most famous work is The Medium is the Message.
Yep.
And you showed us everything that's bad about education the old way.
Yes.
I would posit that you haven't shown us anything good about education the old way, and I would point that there are some things.
Hopefully you know about some of those yourselves.
Yeah. I mean, some of the things that you show these students doing, I could have done without that. But
Fair enough.
you showed me this wonderful world and the great things that can be done with it. But just as there are biases in the old world without computers, there are these inherent biases as well in this new world.
Thank heavens you recognize that.
And this connectivity.
Yeah.
So this is the part that I never hear about in any educational talk, which is, how can this be misused? What should we be watching out for? I mean, allowing students to run off and everything is great, but I think as we can see what's happening in blogs across the world, that sometimes leads to lots of problems. So, question, what do you see as the biggest issues that need to be resolved or we need to watch out for when we turn our classrooms this way?
What are the biggest issues that need to be resolved currently in education in the old model?
What was the biggest issue before?
Yeah.
Students weren't thinking. They were just sitting there. If I was just doing the things the way you said.
Yeah. I don't think that problem changes. Frankly, I don't think the technology has anything to do with anything. I think it's the same problems that, look, if you read Roman teachers, what they're complaining about is students don't pay attention, they're lazy. In my day, we weren't as lazy, but these newfangled students, 2,000 years ago, they just don't know how to focus, right? I don't think it ever changes. I don't think there's fundamentally any difference. And I think the technology, ironically enough, is irrelevant. For example, when I was a student, we had a technology. I used it to do gaming. I used it to do social networking. And I used it to access and work on other stuff in class. We called it paper. And I could write notes to friends, and I could play games with people, and I could do stuff. The teacher thought I was taking careful notes. That doesn't change. Students are going to be disengaged if they can be. They were before, they will be now. So fundamentally, you have to think about a way to engage students. I don't think there's any difference. I agree. I haven't spent time talking about the benefits of the old system or the detriments of the new system, because my guess is you understand both of those already, because those things never change. Now, here's the thing. So I hear teachers all the time say, yeah, but students just use these things for irrelevant stuff. They're just using it for all this, social networking stuff. They don't. Well, okay, so how much time are we spending helping them learn to use those tools productively? Because mostly what we say is, put that away, which actually isn't, it turns out, a discussion about how to use them productively. So are we surprised then? It reminds me of something like, Mary Wollstonecraft's argument about, women and women's capabilities in the 18th century, where she's fighting a culture that doesn't educate women, and then points to women who aren't educated and says, see, women don't know anything, so they shouldn't be educated. Well, at a certain point, you just have to break that cycle. So we've got people pointing to technology and saying, look at that technology. No one's using it productively. Therefore, we're going to shut it down and not ever talk about it, so no one will ever learn to use it productively. And then we can point to that and say, look, they're not using it productively. But that would be my answer. But you're unhappy with that answer.
Well, in as much as I'm looking for those other issues that technology brings to it. There are technologies we produced in the past that have actually destroyed communities.
Indeed.
And so now you're telling me this one enhances communities, but then what, not just the lazy student, I don't want to, you're right, we'll always have those, but what are the bigger issues that these technologies change information? That's what McLuhan's comment was, is that putting it through that technology will change what it means, what it does. For instance, could I teach somebody, all the way through a PhD program, possibly through this, or is it, I'm not really going to get the same kind of grad students later on?
Sure. You won't, by the way. You won't get the same kind of grad students later on, which is not a bad thing. I think what you've articulated is exactly the question that you and your colleagues and your students have to answer. That is to say, we're at the dawn of a new medium. I don't know what's going to work and what's not going to work. That's what our task is as educators, to find out. And I don't know what that will look like. We will figure it out. By the way, so I'm a medievalist. You heard that. My focus is actually on 14th century heretical texts and the pedagogies that heretics deployed to disseminate those texts. And here's a really fascinating thing. So I've studied a lot about medieval learning. Do you know that in the 15th century, when books are introduced, the textbook is introduced, universities fight it when the printing press is introduced? Look, it's going to make students lazy. It gives them this distracting tool, because now it used to be that the teacher, lecture, by the way, comes from the Latin word to read, right? Lecture was the teacher would get the book and read it out loud to the class so the class could copy it. Now all of a sudden, what do I need to do as a teacher? The students already have the book in front of them, and it's going to destroy learning. But we figured out a way to work with textbooks. And in fact, most of you now would say, well, I can't imagine teaching without a printed textbook. I think the same will be true of these technologies. Nothing changes. We've been through these same arguments before, and what we have to do is figure out what new things can we do that we couldn't do before. Now, McLuhan will say some things that we used to do before will disappear, but some things that had disappeared are going to come back. And every system bears within it the seeds of its own destruction. That is, there will be a thing that will cause this system to collapse, and then there will be something else after it. That's okay. That's how we live as humans. We've done it for a while. Yeah. Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
I'm getting closer and closer to retirement. So what I'm going to ask...
As are we all, it turns out.
doesn't have as much to do with me as it does with junior faculty.
Sure.
First, I want you to know that all the senior administrators and board of trustees members raise your hand. You don't count.
Well, if you don't count him, you got nobody else, it looks like.
Well, anyway, how are you able to allow teachers to innovate when above them is a system that will punish them for innovating?
Yeah. You'll recall that my focus was on heresy, right? Well, I think at a certain point, what starts out as a heretical idea later becomes mainstream. But I think you got to have two things. You got to have faculty who are willing to try stuff because they recognize the current model's not working. Or there are ways that they could do it better, or ways that innovation would let them get to stuff they couldn't get to before. And then you do have to have, frankly, administrators who recognize that innovation is what drives universities. It should be what drives universities. It turns out what you need are more visionaries than managers. Managers want stuff predictable because that way I know what's going to happen. And I can parse that out and I don't have to work very hard. You know, in the middle of administrator is that word minister, which suggests a kind of service that maybe has become a kind of hierarchy. And maybe we need to return it to a kind of service. So administrators probably need to work harder to make that environment happen and to be less concerned with making their own jobs easier. The irony, of course, is that everybody tries to make their own jobs easier. So teachers want to do that too. If it's easier for me to give a canned lecture, frankly, than it is to do all this kind of individual work with individual students. But what I've stopped doing, of course, is I no longer prepare for class. Why should I? I mean, I prepare an infrastructure for class, but I don't prepare talks anymore. Like, I never do this in my classes. I never bring information to class anymore. Why would I do that? My students can get, you got information about Mitra in less than a minute. I don't have to go to the library. It doesn't take days to find stuff. It takes milliseconds to find stuff. And by the way, that's a problem that's about to get a lot worse. According to the American Library Association, by 2020, 8 short years from now, information on the internet will be doubling. If current trends continue, information on the internet will be doubling every 15 minutes. Which means you teach a 1-hour class, this is geometric growth, there's 16 times more stuff. Teach a 3-hour graduate seminar, there's 4,096 times more stuff when you get out of class than when you went in. If you're delivering information to them, that information could have been replaced 5 times while you're talking. So if the critical thing is helping students learn how to live in that world. And I think that's frankly the way to get teachers and administrators to recognize what we've got to do. I can't keep pretending that information moves slowly. And if I'm going to help my students not drown, that means, by the way, 4 years after this year's freshman class graduates, if I want to help them not drown, then they have to be the ones finding and processing the information. And that means I don't have to do that anymore, so I can focus on helping them parse it, understand it. I can work a lot with their product and much less with the process.
We have time for one more question.
I think part of that process also needs to be educating our students in digital citizenship.
Absolutely.
I teach fine arts music online.
Well done.
We're going to watch we watched an online concert last week on YouTube. But they had a writing activity where they had kind of like a scavenger hunt or find a wrote a piece online, bring it back and share it in a blog, and write a reflection on it. And here are your guidelines for the reflection. 70% of the class did it, 35% of it was plagiarized. And I had a student come ask me, why was it plagiarized? I just copied what was on YouTube. So digital citizenship, above all of this.
Yeah.
You can't just steal somebody's work and post it with your name on it and give it an A.
This is absolutely true and at the same time problematic. And here's why. So if you look at the university before print, before the printing press, plagiarism is rampant. I mean, that's what you do. You have people stealing one another's ideas. You have people pretending to be people they're not. You have all kinds of things going on. And there's a model in which the notion is just, look, the more you share and remix stuff, the better it is. Now, that makes your skin it makes my skin kind of crawl. I'm an English teacher, for goodness sakes. So I spent half my career, right, talking to students about the importance of plagiarism in a one-on-one situation because they've done it, right? I mean, thousands of hours in my office and other places, and kicking students out of school. But I also recognize that a lot of our ideas about intellectual property emerged out of a particular corporate culture that had to do with printing. Right? And it was pretty messy, by the way. If you look at, especially 17th and 18th century stuff, it is a very messy world for a couple hundred years after the printing press gets invented. And then it finally settles down. We're moving into a new system. Now, I want my students always to acknowledge when they didn't create stuff. But I also have to acknowledge that in remix culture, taking this and taking that and blending them together and adding some of your own sauce, that might not exactly be the same thing. Like that might be what we call a really popular rap song. I took that hook from this person and that hook from that person. I added my own lyrics on the top. I have a new thing. Or Lady Gaga, or anyone, right? I mean, it turns out it's happened for a long time. I need my students to understand that aspect too, and that's an aspect that's emerging. It turns out, I think, that some of our ideas about what constitutes and doesn't constitute intellectual property is going to change in this new system as well. I'm a big fan of Creative Commons. I'm teaching my students about that a lot. That lets you do things like you can take that picture and you can remix it and you can add in your stuff and you don't have to say anything. Or you can say, hey, I got this from that person. Or you can say, or you can't do anything to it. But at least there's a much broader sense of what is possible. But those are, again, questions we've got to figure out and answer, because it turns out you can't look to someone who's already built it. Part of our idea is we live in a system that's already so established that you can always point back, well, that's what you're supposed to do. But we're in a new system, a fundamentally new age. And that means we're the ones who have to make the resources that later people are going to point back to and say, oh, well, that's how you do that. Yeah. No, of course. And when they're not, but let's get to the thing that's behind that, which is the problem is not cutting and pasting. The problem is you're not thinking about how you're cutting and pasting. So let's focus on those issues. But we've got to deal with that. But we've also got to figure out a way that matches some of the ways, because, okay, you've had them link a YouTube. Well, and I linked the Wikipedia article, so what's the problem? What's the difference? Well, there is a difference. But again, we're not addressing that very well. We're certainly not addressing it in school before they get to college. Because all we're caring about there is, what their standardized test scores are so that the school district can get its funding. So it turns out the work of the university is actually much harder now because K-12 is not really doing the job that it was designed to do anymore. Because we don't care about that job, apparently, as a culture. Not that I would say that out loud on video. Hi. I think we have to, do we?
We really have to wrap up.
But we can chat later. Thanks.